this is Ludwig, and today we're going to be having a delightful conversation on well, it's not delightful, I suppose, realizing that you're completely dependent on authority to realize anything, and need authorities to realize which authorities bother. But I would suggest maybe perhaps doing something else with your time. This would not... Michelle, was it so lovely to speak to you about the inescapable tendency toward authoritarianism in all human beings? Perhaps, always perhaps...
Mr. Ludwig, always a pleasure.
Ah, yeah. Is it a pleasure? I mean, what is pleasure? Do we even know what pleasure is? Do we even have certainty about pleasure? My gosh. Yeah, anyway, so we did this story a long time ago called Ludwig. Ludwig Wittgenstein, inspired on his book On Certainty, where he has this wonderful line in there where he says, in order for the door to close, the hinges must stay put. And what he's trying to get at is that you basically require certainty to function, and yet, how do we establish certainty? Because it doesn't seem possible, and yet it seems like we practically require certainty in order to function. And then we have that paper on certainty and the conflict of mind, which you can get on Amazon. Called On Certainty, which makes distinctions on certainty and confidence.
Yes.
But you have this problem where you require certainty, and yet it would seem like certainty is not possible.
Yes, and it's also with the authority circle, right? Because the thing is that Ludwig, it's a philosophical fiction piece. It sort of drives home this idea of, how do I even know that I exist, let alone, believing certain things that I use to function in the world, Right. Like the short piece the authority circle gets into as well. There is an almost a inescapable reliance on authority and also experts, systems, larger systems, and they get larger as time goes on. I love it with Ludwig where he's just saying he's talking to himself in a mirror.
Right.
But then he's like, is this a mirror? And then,
Right, because who can you trust but yourself, right? You can talk to yourself like it's Descartes, but then it's like, can you even do that? Because it's like, Descartes didn't really go far. He didn't doubt that he doubted, right? Did he go far enough? So am I really a Cartesian? It's like,
right.
Well, yeah, there's this great essay that George Orwell did where he talks about talking with a flat earther. And he makes a point. He's like George Orwell, who wrote 1984, the great horrifying book on totalitarianism and Animal Farm. He makes a point that if he himself had to prove to someone the world was flat without reliance on anyone but himself, he kind of has this horrible realization where he's like, oh my gosh, I really couldn't do that, could I?
Yeah.
He's like, oh wait, I could take him down to the beach. He goes, okay. So they go down to the beach, and there's a ship on the ocean. He's like, look over there, and the ship goes lower as it goes on the horizon. It's like, so the world can't be flat because it's going fine. The person he's with nods, and he says, okay, well the Earth's oval then, So and Orwell's like, crap, he's like, so maybe it's just an oval Earth. I don't know. And the point he's getting at is he's like, something like everyone knows the world is round, right? Everyone knows that, but have you yourself gone to the moon to see that the world is round?
Sure, or taking the measurements yourself? And he's like, well, no, you're relying on an authority. And of course, this is the man who wrote 1984. This is really critical. Orwell was actually one of these great writers. He himself is a socialist. He writes The Wigan and Peer. He does so much work on the working class being taken advantage of. But then he's also aware of how centralization of government can give you 1984, and he's also aware of an Animal Farm, how the communist revolution didn't work out so well, and yet, so he's an example of someone I would just consider a true thinker. He who believes in socialism, who believes in government taking care of the working class, but he also is thinking through the possible tragic implications or ways that could go wrong, and that's a true thinker. In the same way that, if you're on a conservative side, you're thinking about free will. Well, what about a world where everyone's free, but they don't take responsibility for their freedom? So you've got to have, deep thinking. Orwell was just an example of a deep thinker, but he writes this piece on the problem of authority, on how knowledge is so dependent on authority, where he's also extremely concerned about authorities being authoritarian. So there's this real serious dilemma there that Orwell's exploring. Yeah, certainly. And I think too, when you just go down to anything that you might believe or hold as a truth or even a premise, it is very interesting how much just knowing some historical fact that occurred.
Yeah.
Well, were you there?
Have you gone to the archives?
Have you seen? Yeah. Have you gone to the archives yourself? Yeah, even if you, it's just interesting because we've got such a game of telephone going.
Yes.
And you know how that goes when you play it in person.
Yes.
And I'm not. That doesn't mean that something that was stated
100 years ago isn't the same statement now in oral tradition. But there's there's so much actually trust you kind of have to put in in others, in your lineage, in the historians, in there's just in enormous, like I was even thinking about it in terms of like, say you want to make some sort of good healthy smoothie thing, right? Well, like, did you go to the farm where the berries were harvested? Like, do you know what they put on them? You know what I mean? It's just, there's just such an element of like, well, they said it was, let's just say they said it was organic and non-GMO. Okay, well then I trust that it's not organic and non-GMO.
But do you actually know?
No, you don't.
Yeah.
But you also couldn't, so this is with Ludwig, where there's kind of this insanity moment where you'd really just be like curled up in fetal position if you really like had the realization of this inability to verify any of these things you hold as true. Then you couldn't really function.
You couldn't function. And that's Wittgenstein. It's going back to Wittgenstein, where the hinges of the door must be solid for the door to move. Like he basically says we simply can't doubt everything, is what Wittgenstein talks about. And I think Uncertainty is my favorite book by Wittgenstein. But it's very important to realize that saying that because we received X fact from an authority does not mean that the X fact is not true.
Oh,
we are not saying that because we received so much knowledge from, we're not saying that what you receive from an authority is false. How much easier would it be if you could know that? If you could just know that everything authorities gave you was false, when you could have almost an existential stability, right? You could almost have a certainty because you say, well, it's from an authority, it must be false. No. It's like a mixture.
It's a mixture. It's sometimes it could be true, sometimes it could be false.
Sometimes the government lies to you.
Yeah, exactly.
They do lie to you. And this is the weird thing, like, corporations take advantage of people, and yet you're also relying on corporations to get food.
Yeah, or like
hospitals and all these different things. And so you have reason not to trust them, and yet you have to trust them, or you won't use grocery stores.
Yeah.
So it's a game theory problem. It's like you have to, we talk about rational, irrational, and you have to be non-rational.
Well, the other thing too is just because you can't doubt everything doesn't mean you shouldn't doubt things at the same time.
That's where it's tricky.
Like,
how do you determine when you doubt and when you don't?
Yeah. It's interesting because there's a level, it's almost like being able to reach this place where you're able to question and doubt, but not, completely lose your mind or take nothing for what it's said to be. And it does also,
it's like you can't be clutching, but you also can't have your hand open where everything's falling through. You need to have it set on your open hand, like the bird you
kind of
talk
catch
about.
Things.
Where you catch things, but it's not holding it too tightly.
I'm just going to use that imagery for every single thing.
It works all the time. It's really
great.
It's perfect, Michelle. That was great when you came up with that.
Thank you.
But it's like this ability to hold on, but not so tightly,
and I think too, it's kind of like that, again, that place where you recognize I'm probably there are probably some assumptions in what I'm, even in my rigorous questioning, there's still going to probably be assumptions about that. I think though, maybe the biggest thing that it can do is one of the things it can do is at least make you more humble and sort of more like less kind of, with your dogmatic hammer, just hammering people with what you've come to, right?
Well,
in terms of your questioning.
So there's this great dilemma, is how do you, if you didn't believe you were right at X, you wouldn't do X. Well, how do you believe you're right without being like a fundamentalist or something, right? Like without being like crazy. Like how do you believe you're right without being dogmatic? What does that look like? But you see, the more serious the thing is, maybe you should be dogmatic because people will get hurt or have negative consequences. How do you determine these things? Well, and so like the authority circle really wants to talk about this major problem where in order to like discount an authority, you would need another authority to discount it unless you're doing the work yourself. But like Ludwig talks about this, like maybe you're a physicist and you literally have actually studied quantum mechanics yourself. Maybe you really have. So this is not based on authority. You are the authority. Well, you can't be an authority in everything. What about chemistry? Yeah. What about global, other issues, food, environment? Like you can't be an authority at everything. But so let's say that the guy comes up and he says, oh, this product here is non-GMO. This food is healthy for you. And you doubt it. You say, I don't know. I think this guy's pulling a fast one on me. Well, you would have to go to their vegetable garden. You'd have to go to the fields and see for yourself. Or you'd have to get another authority who confirmed it. They say, yeah, no, we've done some stuff. We're fact checkers.
Or maybe not authority. Like, what if you entrust a friend because you know them better? You
Sure,
know
but that would be a kind of authority, right? Like the friend, you're trusting in their insight.
Right, and that's why I think the word authority can always be kind of given to.
Sure.
But it's really like this idea
Reliance.
of who you put your trust in, right? Like your trust.
Who do you think is an authority?
Yeah.
Because an authority, I guess, would mean like you trust them enough to act on it.
Yeah.
So it's not merely like in your head, like you're acting on what your friend said.
Yes. Well, and I think, too, a good balance between realizing that you're inevitably going to be having some level of trust in some, authority or, figure who's going to then give you information that then you say, I take that for what it is. I believe that. There's going to be that in one's life. It's just inevitable, because even if you're maybe not doing it in larger scales with like very distant experts, you might still do it with your mom or dad, or you know what I mean, or your pastor, or like your teacher or professor. But I do think that's something that could balance the risk of that, because there is a vulnerability in that, right? Because say it is especially the more distance there is, there's the more potential of being like taken advantage of by that. And that's why I think authority circle gets really great into
system
that.
Size,
system size, because the smaller the system, the more likely you are not being taken advantage of. It's truly like
you
the
can
authority. Because they care for you, they know you, right? Like your parents, they know you, so they care for you.
That's right.
They're going to tell you the truth.
That's right. The common line.
Yeah, but I'll say something to check the especially the bigger system authority could also be to understand the value of your own experience, because that's really the only thing you have that you can say. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of your only authority you have in terms of, which is powerful. It's not the only, but it's just, it can often be bracketed out as, well, it doesn't really matter or count because it's not some larger or some more larger in a bigger way ascribed to type of authority that's saying this happens or this doesn't happen. Your own experience you have to just, even if you just validate yourself, you need to validate your own experience. This is what I experienced, this is what I've seen, this is what I've witnessed, and realize that could possibly be like a check in a sense to the vulnerability of the situation.
There's
of the
no
authority.
doubt that this Ludwig saying you should be on the floor in a fetal position is way worse if you fall into the noumenon trap, where subjective experience has nothing to do with reality. So then all you've got is the authority.
Exactly.
If we at least take something a little more Hegelian, where consciousness is for itself and more reliable, then you're not completely lost. So that's, I think, a very important point, to trust in your experience. But of course with an open hand, because, not firm.
Well, and realizing that someone else could have a different experience.
Yes. Because like you say, if you don't trust in your experience, then you really are. Ultimately, everything comes down to authorities, and that's alienating. That's existentially unnerving. And what ends up happening is then, well, you see, what we have now is I think increasingly people are realizing, and they weren't prepared for it maybe, and I mean none of us are, for finding out how much their knowledge is dependent on authorities. I mean, we see it with COVID, you see it with government, like how much like people are finding out they are reliant on what experts say for or against or whatever. And the problem is, of course, it's just my experts against your experts. It's like my expert said this, your expert said that. Well, mine are certified, your are non-certified. Well, yours lied earlier, mine didn't lie, and it becomes like people don't know what to do. Like you're encountering this massive problem of the role of authority, and you feel helpless, and people are existentially unnerved, and it's chaos. But if you at least had some philosophical training, or you knew about this, you would start looking for spaces between. You would look for ways. Well, how do we advance and it not simply come to a debate of whose authority said what? That's one of the big things in philosophy. We'll train. It's like, all right, well, let's try to find ways to approach these situations that don't just come down to whose authorities are right versus not. Let's say, like, okay, well, if you're right about X, then Y, and if the people over here are right about Z, then Y. Well, either way, Y. So it doesn't matter whose authorities is right.
Exactly.
We're going to go with Y. That would be kind of the structure that you would look for. But you're not going to look for that. You're not going to realize the importance of that if you ultimately don't understand the inescapability of authorities. And therefore basically the ineptitude of authorities to resolve authority dilemmas. Because how do you know which authority, like it becomes an infinite regress. Because how do you know which authority is the authority? Because other authorities said so. Well, how do you know those authorities are because other authorities said so? You get an infinite regress.
It's like the person just pointing back to the other person, and then it's just this chain, and it ends up being that they're pointing at nobody.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's an infinite regress problem.
Yeah.
And so
there's a potential for that.
There is a potential for that. And so, like, if it comes down to just whose authorities say what, everyone's going to look, and like you can say, well, their authorities aren't real authorities. Well, the other people really feel like they are, and so you saying that is not going to convince them.
Exactly.
And so I just, this is just another example where philosophical reasoning or logic and all these things are looking, and also like you're saying, taking experience seriously. All these can play a very important role with this very serious problem of the authority circle.
Yeah.
And before I forget, the authority circle is to be associated with the hermeneutical circle in Heidegger, which is this problem of how do you know what the author really intended in the book? Well, you would have to get in the author's head, but you can't do that. So how do you ever figure out if your interpretation is the interpretation? How do you ever know that you're in the text to really get at it? And it's this hermeneutical circle. It's really difficult. You can't do that. Yeah. So likewise, you'd have to be the authorities to know if your view is actually right. But even if you could do that for one thing, like you can kind of get inside the hermeneutical circle if you're the author themselves, right? Writing the book. But then, of course, maybe you're mistaken about your own thoughts. Likewise, the scientist might be mistaken about their own conclusions. So even there, if you are the authority, you might be wrong. The author may not know all the reasons the book formed the way they did. So, you have this circle that's hard to enter.
Absolutely. And why did I never make that connection?
Oh, the hermeneutical circle?
Well, author, the word author and like authority.
Yeah, they go together.
I never ever connected those words together.
Those words. That's good. That's really good. Yeah,
That's fascinating.
Oh, I love, the other one I love is dictator and dictate.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's like really weird. There's these really interesting connections between author and authority.
Well, see, I think, and that makes so much. See, there's almost a way in which, like, you know how you said, like, we're in some ways we're kind of, or like you said at the very beginning in your Ludwig voice, which is like we're kind of oriented towards
authoritarian.
Yes, because we want, it's comforting in a way, like in a kind of infantile way to have some sort of authority author, right?
Yes.
But the risky things is when it's when men and the people of the earth become the ultimate author. Yes. That's when it can be risky. However, there's also an inevitability of it because we do live in systems, right? Like we Absolutely. Live unless you're literally in the woods and you're not using public roads and things like that. You still have some sort of connection to that to those larger systems. So like you talk about too with the authority circle, there does seem to be this very strange almost reliance on the authority, but that very reliance almost usurps the people's ability to really make their own valuation because in some ways they have to give that valuation up to an authority. But then if they realize all of a sudden, oh wait, I am doing that, then it can be very, very destabilizing.
Absolutely.
And so like you're saying, I mean, obviously I think that the philosophy gives you a good bearings for sure. And it's interesting because even to do some of the work to kind of give yourself some sort of equip yourself a bit in that space, that can often seem very contrarian.
Yeah, I mean, almost by definition.
Experience apart from that authority's consensus.
Almost by definition, it's not contrarian if the authority is for it. And but if you're not an authority, who do you think you are? Like to be contrarian, you have this circular problem.
Exactly, it's kind of like and the validation really is not it's because kind of like, well, can you say that or can you even come to that conclusion? Yeah,
how do you do it? Like, on what grounds do you do it?
The noumenon, I think that the problem you really get into a lot with the noumenon is it really does not help with this problem.
No, because any, like, if you've done X 100 times and there's always been Y, but no authority has ever done a study to confirm X leads to Y, then you'll just go, well, I don't know, X, it's just random.
They just said, it doesn't. Even though it's happened
so it doesn't. 100 times, but the authority said, so you don't have any defense.
Exactly.
You have no defense. Well, a few things. We require authorities to basically think on anything outside our immediate common life, which, by the way, the authority circuit, if you take that seriously, then you do put different levels of stock in things that are outside your common life that you can't confirm with experience versus things that are like abstract and out there, Washington, D.C., big corporate systems. Like, you are definitely going to rely on authorities when it comes to understanding the entire global governing system, right? Well, if if there's this authority circle problem, you're going to have some view of it, but you're always going to hold it differently if you understand this authority circle problem. And you're also not going to drive yourself, like, get super invested in it, like in a bad way, right? Because you're going to understand that ultimately the authorities could be wrong, or they could be tricking you, or different things like that. And you're going to put a little more stock in your everyday life, your common life, the people you know, and being present in your life. So there's a way to take what we're saying about the authority and make you organize your focuses in a positive way.
Yeah, I was talking to you about Ludwig, and it's like, well, can't you believe your eyes, like what you see? And then, you said, like, well, we could be in a simulation, right. So it's like, there is always this element of trust that's going on, right? Where you have to kind of trust your own eyes and your own phenomenological experience and input you're receiving, you know. And then, too, it's kind of like, well, I don't know if it's a simulation or not, but I have to go pick that corn. It's kind of like there's just still things you must do, right, in order to live your life and to kind of make the most of it.
Yeah, that come out in your common life.
Yeah, they come out in your common life.
It's not that you disregard everything outside your common life and lived experience, but you hold it differently. You have a different level of investment in them. Right,
and you don't always think, because it's there is a kind of a movement towards more of the outsourcing, going out, sort of, right, leaving the home to go to college. Nothing wrong with those things, but it's just, it can kind of put into perspective kind of what should be a check to that, right? Kind of like understanding that if it's ultimately not going to kind of have an appreciation, a really deep, almost, I don't want to say reverence, but a real deep appreciation for the common life and kind of a contribution back into that, then it's a problem. There's a risk to that, for sure.
Well, and the other thing is just, it's important, is if you take all this seriously, then you also start putting a lot more stock in thought that is not reliant on authorities, which is also going to mean thought that's not just like the exchange of facts, because facts are almost by definition things that are given to you from authorities. So you become more philosophically minded. You become more interested in philosophical discussions and logical discussions and aesthetic conversations, because those are not so prone to authority. Like the aesthetic experience of Dostoevsky, sure, there are literary critics, but there's also your experience that you had, and you get invested in that. You get more invested in ideas instead of getting the facts right. So it also, taking the authority circle seriously, helps you avoid, as we mentioned in a previous OG Rose conversation, the trivia that Neil Postman talks about. You don't fall into that trivia stuff, because the structure of trivia conversations is inherently authority-based. And
100%.
And so you will... and you just have different kinds of conversations, because if you know there's an authority circle, if facts basically always entail authority circles, which you can't enter, then you're going to avoid those unless you really need them. But of course you have to bring in facts at some points, and there's going to be some level, there's always ultimately some involvement of authorities, but you're going to try to mitigate it as much as possible, because every time you bring in authority, what are you vulnerable to? Authoritarianism. If we ultimately have to rely on authorities, then authoritarian possibilities are inescapable for the human condition. They're always going to be present, and we're always going to be vulnerable to them. So if we can avoid, so you just start to think about, how can I have conversations or political discussions that ultimately aren't going to be my authorities versus yours, or that's not going to consist of facts that ultimately are reliant on authorities. You try really, really hard to find purely logic-based points or purely philosophical kind of directions to take conversations, to try to avoid authoritarian vulnerabilities as much as possible. You can't entirely avoid them, and you wouldn't want to entirely avoid them, because if you had no authority in your life, then you'd have basically no facts, no science, and things would be a mess. But there becomes a certain reverential concern, a reverential feel, a healthy level of concern with the role of authority in your life, because every time there's authority, there's authoritarian vulnerability.
Right. So really just being very, very aware of that risk.
Yes.
And then I think too,
just like being aware when you're dealing with fire. Of course you need to deal with fire. You need to be aware when you drive a car. No one's saying you shouldn't drive a car, but if you're aware that you can die when you drive a car, you think about it differently.
Yeah, exactly.
Likewise, if you are not aware of the authority circle and you just carelessly enter into conversations where it's my authority versus your authorities, you become more aware of the danger of those kind of conversations.
Yeah, it's funny you brought up fire, because I was thinking about Nausicaa, that amazing movie by Hayao Miyazaki, and I love that movie so much, and one of the things that I appreciate so much about this one tribe that is deciding they're not going to just get rid of the toxic jungle and insects. Like they have to work with it, right? Because it's there. So they say, you know, we're not going to get rid of them. And then like the princess who opposes from the other tribe says, you know, well, like, this makes no sense. Like, they're trying to get rid of you. They're trying to kill you. Why wouldn't you just kill them? And then the man says, well, because they'll always be there. So we're going to have to just live with them. And he talks about using fire. We use fire, but we use it in select areas. We don't use fire on the whole thing, you know, because it actually only exacerbates it, and it comes back even stronger. So I think that selectivity of kind of being able to understand that it's going to happen, but try if you can to limit it to where it's necessary, right? And that's difficult to always to discern where it's necessary, but there is an element of it where, you know, basically to be able to have some limitations on it, I think is probably going to be where you also limit the risk.
Well, basically, I mean, that's wonderful, and yes, everyone should watch that movie, because everything that Ghibli does is crazy.
Please watch that movie.
I don't understand. Like, Joe Hisaishi, all these people, it's unbelievable. This idea of using fire selectively. Yes. So likewise, if we were to think about using authorities selectively, you know, try to, not all the time, but selectively, you'd have different conversations. Of course you would bring in facts. Of course you would bring in authorities and different things, but you would do it in a different way. Right now, basically people bring in authorities first thing in a conversation to crush whoever they're talking about as quickly as possible, because you're a Democrat or you're a liberal and my authorities, my scientists, you're not doing true science, you're not doing true... Like, every conversation now is like a war against authorities versus other authorities, all of which
right, left,
has no...
both sides.
Yeah, it's insane. And all of that suggests people not taking seriously the dilemma of the authority circle, not taking seriously that they're playing with fire, and not taking seriously the fact you're inviting authoritarianism. You know, you would be much more selective, much more careful, and just have an entirely different disposition on when you summoned authority, when you used authorities, and how you talked about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why, like you mentioned, the risk too on the micro level is that you become very authoritarian in your conversations.
Extremely.
Right? And it's much more... there can be even something slightly oppressive about those types of conversations.
Absolutely.
Very, very kind of volatile, and
no
a power struggle, basically.
Well, how do you make progress? Once I say my experts say X, you say your experts say Y.
Yeah.
What is there
the
to
same
talk about?
accreditation or something like that. It's like, okay, well,
what can we do? And it is authoritarian, because then I'm like, my experts, I'm shoving them down their throat. Like, you become authoritarian in your referral to authorities.
Well, and this is why I think, like you said, where it's so much, it's great if you can really incorporate, honestly, like the humanities types of conversation, the arts, creativity into the conversation, because, you know, story is like what's really kind of getting lost, I think, a lot. Important
it's Hegel again.
elements.
Well, I mean, if it's subjective, it's not true. I mean, it's the problem of the noumenon again. Like, if it's a story, it could have nothing to do with the actual, because it's a reflection of subjectivity, and subjectivity is what keeps you from getting to the things themselves. Right, so, you know, that all occurs. I mean, it takes philosophy to know when you bring in personal experience, when you don't. Like, personal experience you hold in a different way, like when science applies, when it doesn't. All of that is epistemological reasoning, of which, if you don't have philosophical training, you will not have. So you will not know when it's appropriate to bring in story, when it's not appropriate to bring in story. It's all just random. It's all just whatever people randomly bring in.
But it's an art form, right?
It is an art form.
And that's where it's
well, conversation was considered an art form. Like, rhetoric, all these things was considered an art form. Now it's a debate. Like, conversations are just political. They're like not art. They're politics.
And this does bring up so much about what we talked about with the trivial, because it really does become just because people can check things on their phones so quickly, and they can check on the internet so quickly, then they're like, well, why wouldn't I just do that? And that overrides people's stories.
And that all of that is an appeal to it. The phone becomes oppressive. The phone becomes an authoritarian, because I'll check it, this fact, boom, you now have to conform to it. You know, you said X, I check my phone, actually it's Y, and now you have to conform and admit you were wrong. It's like this oppressive force. Which maybe it's good. I mean, maybe the thing you're saying is crazy, so I can help you, but every time you do, you should always have a certain reverential fear, like a reverential concern.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's almost like we forget that we are, in a sense, authors, right, of our own lives. So then we always just think, well, somebody else, and there's a wonderful thing in recognizing the authors of the past who have probably spent much more time and effort and energy and blood, sweat, and tears in making their book or their novel series or whatever it is. But it's like that is very, very valid. so is your own life and your own story and your own authorship, if you will.
Oh, yeah. Well, it becomes this thing where we've all become monotheists for the official authority, when we need to be polytheists that have reverence for the authority of the scientist who's been in the lab for 40 years studying X. And you should take their what they say seriously. But you also want to have take seriously the authority of the life that you are authoring in your own experience, and you also want to take seriously the authority of the lives that the guy who runs the hardware store down the road has said, and his knowledge about small business. Like everyone, you want to be a polytheist, but right now, basically, it would seem because of school, you're structured to think only in terms of the best experts and what they say, and you have no power. You're powerless. That's the other. So there's a powerless
you're also not responsible.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the problem, right? Is because the lack of the lack of power and the lack of responsibility go together.
Yes.
But we don't want to be responsible. But we don't tend to realize that if we're not responsible, that means we're powerless. We want to be both powerful and not responsible. But if you have power, you have responsibility, right? And so it's this kind of mess. The thing is, what we do, because it's the Eric Fromm, the psycho, who kind of talk about that, we don't want freedom. We want to escape freedom. Dostoevsky and the Grand Inquisitor. And so we want to have authorities to tell us what to think so we don't have to think for ourselves. Although while we do it in a manner that convinces us we're not relying on the authorities to do our thinking for us. In fact, we're thinking because we're relying on the authorities, and that's what smart people do. You're thinking to rely on the authorities, so you're smart, and maybe you are. But again, you need to have a certain reverential fear of this relationship to authorities, a certain reverential understanding of what it means. The human being is always at risk of authoritarianism because we are inescapably having to play with the fire of authority. We are always at risk of authoritarianism because we are always necessarily having to play with the fire of authority. Yes. And if you take that seriously, you're going to play with the fire less than you have to and in a different way than you have to. But none of this is even going to occur to people if all they ever talk about is thinking for themselves or standing up against the status quo or, not taking, all of our language makes it out to be that we think for ourselves. And so you don't think that you're relying on authorities as you are relying on authorities. So you're certainly not going to realize this paradoxical dilemma. You're just going to be using your authorities. Like these people now in these political discussions who are crushing one another by referring to their authorities, they feel like they're thinking for themselves. So you don't realize you're playing with this fire of authority, which could risk authoritarianism, because you don't even think you're relying on authority. You just think you're thinking for yourself. So you're not even aware of what you're doing.
Right. And that's why I think I brought up the humbling point, right? Because it's like if you realize that, you're going to be less, apt to just kind of going around with your dogmatic hammer just smashing everybody. And it's funny whenever you talk about that, like two people, two sides. I think about like the game of war with cards, or like, and you like put down your cards, like. Whose card seems to be more powerful? The king or the queen?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
And so it's like, oh well, he has like 2 more letters after his name versus 3 more. This doctor has 4 more letters after his name, so that one wins. It's like you just kind of use these things like, and it's very, very fascinating. And I think I'm always interested. I'm always talking with you about like intuition, and obviously that can be that's a big term there. That can be both good and bad. But another risk to not recognizing both the need and also the risk of authority is to undermine the story of your own and your own intuition. Like, right, you're like kind of your instinctual things that are almost kind of very primal, like related to your own physical survival.
I mean, this is the issue. Like, what do you do if an authority tells you that you can't trust, the rumbling of your tummy? What would you do? You'd go, well, they have a PhD. I don't know. Like.
When it sounds so silly in that example.
Yes, but
if you think about it, there are certain ways in which we have sort of outsourced some of the things that are instinctual to authorities, which again maybe for good. But
you have authorities around the world.
You
can only have one kid, like in China, or you can't, like, driving certain cars destroys the environment, or working. You've had a farm your entire life. Well, that contributes to global warming because of the gases the cows give up. There are authorities that are telling you things that may be true, that might be right, but how do you weigh that against your lived experience and your own impressions and different things like that?
Exactly.
If you don't have philosophical reasoning, there is no hope. And in fact, basically what you will do, this is what is happening. If the expert comes along and says something like, oh, you can only have one kid because of world population or whatever, you go find experts that say that those experts are wrong. This is what everyone does. If they don't like the policies that their state is doing on COVID, they go look for experts that say those policies don't work. Whatever side you're on, that's the tendency. You go to another expert. You look for a different authority. That is the natural human tendency, which in of itself suggests our authoritarian nature, our nature to be authoritarian. What you don't see people, the average person does not philosophically reflect or reason about what they hear or compare it with their personal experience and so on and so forth. The instinctual act that people have when they encounter something they don't like is to go find an authority that disagrees.
Well, it's interesting, and I think you're right, Daniel. I think you're right with that, but I do wonder, though, if people do that simply because they just feel like, well, this person's definitely not going to believe me if I just say, I don't agree with that, or
But that just means there's a social reinforcing of the problem then. Like, then you have a collective social reinforcing of searching for authorities. So everyone's pressuring everyone else to get authorities. Yeah, you could do it for that reason. Like, we really do not appreciate how much our condition is primed for authoritarianism.
But I guess what I mean to say is, like, is it primed simply because the other people are doing it, and the other people who maybe first put down their war card, right? When you're playing with your little deck of cards, you're like, well, they put down a card. I can't just put my fingers out. Like, I've got a 2.
Sure, but that's social reinforcement.
Okay, I guess I should use my card, and I put it. Okay, so social reinforcement. But it's like, maybe more people would,
Yeah, if everyone did it different, it might be different. I mean,
yeah,
sure.
I mean, maybe if enough people just said, like, well, I don't really care what the experts say. This is just my own experience and my own feeling or something like that.
But then they might go out and, because they're not using authority and they all die because you need authorities to figure out how to navigate. That's the existential risk.
Right. Maybe not.
Maybe not. But that's what hopefully Ludwig and the authority circle bring out, the existential anxiety, existential difficulty of the situation. And how primed we are for authoritarianism. We really don't think we're primed for authoritarianism. We think we're naturally free. We think we naturally desire freedom. We think we naturally think for ourselves.
Yes.
We really underappreciate how much we rely on authority for facts. We really do not appreciate how primed we are for authoritarianism and how we participate in authoritarianism because we need authorities, because authorities are necessary. We do not appreciate the severity of our situation, and someone like Orwell did. Orwell did, and we don't. And if we did take it seriously, the way we talked with one another, the way we debated, what we prioritized, how we talked would be very different.
Yeah, and I mean, that's why at the end of the authority circle, you mentioned about perhaps this is why history repeats itself,
Yes. Well, we have to do something in our evenings, I suppose, if we're given that we're here and on some sort of simulation that isn't another simulation. But it is night now. I suppose the kids are awake, if there are kids, and well, maybe they're not kids, maybe they're just little adults, and not so kids exist. But perhaps you've all had a good time. Perhaps this has been OG Rose Conversations. Thank you for your time, and you can find us on Instagram and Facebook. Perhaps, always perhaps.